Welcome back. Today we are going to work on drum mixing. So I'm going to show you a few things that I do. There are a lot of different ways to mix drums, so I'm just going to give you some ideas. I'm not saying everything I do is exactly how you should do it, although it works for me and it's very repeatable. So I'm going to try to give you some workflow ideas, some routing ideas. We're going to talk about gain staging, and then the stuff that everybody kind of assumes we're going to talk about most, compression and EQ as well. So here we go. This is the track we already did some triggering. So this is what I made a video a little while ago about trigger 2 and how that will maybe help you get rid of some bleed or help you kind of enhance what's already there. So I have these two tracks printed down as audio, and tracks are all cleaned up and ready to go. And so let me show you some routing ideas before we even start. Well, I'll let you hear the track. So we're going for big, epic drums. Looking for a lot of space, a lot of power, and we'll see what we can do. So I'm going to start with doing some routing and some of the technical side of this first. I have a hard time switching back and forth between kind of the creative side of my brain that flows and is able to kind of EQ and compress quickly and by instinct, if I'm constantly bouncing between logistics and artistics. So let's grab these two kick mics here, and my goal is usually to simplify. I want to start thinking about fewer and fewer things as I go. So at the end, I'm not second guessing every single decision. I've just made a decision on certain things and moved on. So one of the ways I do that is submixing. And so I'm going to take these two kick mics. This is a kick in mic and a sub kick on the outside, and subgroup them to a single channel. And then in my brain, I can just think kick drum, instead of, all the variables that go into that. Eventually we'll work down to a drum subgroup. Then we'll work into just an instrumental subgroup of all the band, and then the final mix. So there's a couple ways to subgroup, but I'm going to show you the easiest one, which is to select your two tracks, shift option, so that's apply to all selected tracks, change the output, and go to a new track. It's right there waiting. These are two mono tracks, and they're going to stay panned down the middle. So I'm going to call this kick. And I'm going to ignore these samples for a moment, the kick and snare samples, because we're going to try to mix this without them, and then we're going to add them in as we go. Then snare, there is no other snare mic. Typically you'd have like snare top and snare bottom. So I don't really need a subgroup for that. But eventually when we add in a sample, if we add in a sample, we might decide to use something like that. So then all the others are single mics or stereo pairs. I don't usually group my room mics together because if I'm going to have more than one set of room mics, I'm going to use them differently. So maybe in this case, that was all I needed to subgroup for the moment. And then I'm going to select all my drums. And again, shift option, new track, this time stereo. So I'm going to hit command right. If you look in the top right of the screen, you'll see my shortcuts. Command up and down, change your track type. Command left and right, change your track width. And I'm just going to go ahead and name it drums. And now as I hit play, you'll be able to see the kick mic hitting into the kick subgroup. And if I mute that, then we lose our drums. So that means the kick subgroup is going into the drum subgroup over here. An interesting side note on that, we'll talk about how we get there in a second, but this level on the original kick, let me just do one mic at a time. That's hitting about -3, which hits about -3. And over here, -6. It's 3 dB lower for any mono track that gets panned or brought out into a stereo track. But if I pan it left, it ends up being the same. This is called the stereo pan law. Left and right will be full volume. Down the middle will drop by 3 dB. Command 2 brings up my session window, and you can see it right there, pan depth, -3. You can make it even more. Some of the SSLs did that. But 3 is great. And what that does is allows you to like take a guitar track, pan it left, pan it right, pan it center, and it has relatively the same sort of balance against something like a vocal that's down the middle. So if I pan one hard out, I pan a guitar hard left and right, 2 different passes like a double track, they can be a little bit louder because they're not fighting for that same center channel space as the vocal. You can trick yourself and do some silly things with that, but in general, that's just something to know. So here we go. This is kick, and again, we're going to work on gain staging. So what I'm going to do is give myself, I don't always do this, it depends on who recorded it and how well they recorded it. And I'll just show you this trick. But there's a trim plugin under other, and that will allow you to kind of adjust your levels. Just like on an SSL console strip or a Trident console strip, you'll have a line input trim, and that would allow you to kind of aim for a safe target. If somebody's sending you something really low or really high, you may want to trim it just a little bit. So in this case, that track was coming in kind of right around -1, -2, which probably wouldn't hurt anything, but we will, you likely will, end up using certain things like this, which are analog modeled plugins. And analog modeled plugins are expecting something to be coming in somewhere around, line level, and line level on Pro Tools is kind of in that -6 territory. It's not exactly, but that's the idea. And if you send something in much louder than that, you're going to start running into the red up here and clipping, and that is to be avoided, unless clipping or analog distortion is something you're really looking for. So let me take that back off of there. Let's work on getting our levels into the kick subgroup. And I'm a little bit loud, so I'm going to turn it down. And then I'll balance in this sub kick. The sub kick is all lows. It's kind of woofy. So it's not going to have the punch that I need for a big epic rock track. But the kick in mic sometimes is a little lacking on fullness and body and tone. So add in a little bit of that. And at this point, I'm doing this all by ear, trying to get a nice amount of fullness on it. And now that I've got that, I can turn on my kick group, which remember you can do with A to turn it on and off. And now that I like the balance between those two, I'm going to adjust my level going into the subgroup. And again, I'm aiming for kind of that -6 mark. This doesn't have to be perfect, but I generally am trying to avoid getting up much beyond that. But again, what's going to happen when I go to that stereo track? It's going to drop by 3 dB over here. So I have a little bit of room here if I want to push that up slightly. But I think it's okay that it's a little bit under 6, because by the time I add the rest of these things in, including maybe a kick sample or something down the road, that could change. Snare drum. At this point, now that I've got my kick kind of defining our level, my snare drum, I'm just going to go in by ear and make it work musically. This is sometimes very difficult to do when it's just kick and snare. So you may start benefiting from grabbing vocal, throwing it in there, and trying to wrap things around a sound like that. But my general philosophy behind this is to mix with depth, mix 3-dimensionally. So the louder something is, the closer it's going to sound, especially if it's got a little extra bass and a little extra treble. It's going to sound like you're right up next to it. And then the quieter something is, it will naturally have a little bit less top and bottom coming out of the speakers because it's quieter, and that's just how speakers work. And also, by turning it down, it's going to sort of simulate that distance better. So a lot of rock tracks are going to have the kick and snare very equal right up at the front, and maybe even louder than the lead vocal. that gives you this very aggressive, forward, leaning in kind of sound. And then other tracks are going to have that snare drum back. The kick might be pretty forward still, but the snare drum might be back to create space for the vocalist, but also to kind of create a depth on the mix so it sounds more three-dimensional and it sounds like you're on a larger sound stage. So maybe the drummer's at the back of the stage. But that kick drum being way up front isn't as much of a problem as long as it's not too bright or too mid-rangey. Because if it is, then it starts covering up things like your bass guitar and your vocal, maybe even your rhythm guitars a little bit. But if it's a little bit hollow sounding, we call it scooped. It will only be living mostly in the lows and just a little bit in the highs. And that allows it to be forward without being in the way of anything. And then your mix can have a nice full low end. So this track, if you remember, it was kind of big and epic vibe. I'm sure we'll add some big space to these drums, like reverb, delay, room mics. We got a couple of room mics. So those are going to help us kind of create some depth and some space, make it sound a little bigger than just close mics. So somewhere in there, kick and snare feel kind of equal. Not very big yet, but that doesn't matter. We'll get there. I'm even going to hold off on toms, which have kind of a big role to play in this part, because usually what I'm worried most about is getting my close mics merged into the rest of the mics. I want them to sound like they're a part of the drum kit and not isolated from it. So the biggest way to do that, the best way to do that, is usually the overhead mics, because they're capturing the entire kit. Pan them out wide for you. Just let you listen. Everything's pretty balanced in there except the kick drum, but I hear kick, hi-hat, snare, toms, all kind of showing up in there, crash cymbals. So it's a good setup. Hear a lot of hi-hat there. It's a little tappy sounding to me. The level's fine, technically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it down, get kind of comfortable listening and reset my brain to hear these close mics again. And then as I turn it up, you'll notice that the snare all of a sudden starts to sound further away. Even though it's technically getting louder, we're hearing it more from this overhead perspective, which is further away. And if you notice, it sounds much weaker. The drum doesn't sound like it's hitting as hard. Here it sounds like he's hitting it somewhat hard. And there it just feels kind of medium, like not as aggressive. So I got to be careful with my overheads because they can wash out your drums and take away that nice modern snap. So what a lot of engineers will do is listen for the ambience around the snare drum. And so what I do is I'll pull the overheads way down, listen to the close mics, and then gradually bring it up till I start to hear that openness that we heard when we were doing the triggering stuff too. Here's without, pretty tight, with just a nice little bit of width and ambience added to that. Now, very rarely would you hear cymbals as wide as we're hearing them right now. Like that hi-hat is showing up way over on the left, crash is way over on the right. The only person who gets that perspective is the drummer. And so what I'm going to do is narrow them in a little bit, and that really helps also kind of solidify that the drummer is in a certain place in front of you. As you listen, you'll hear the drums as a cohesive whole rather than a bunch of individual pieces and parts. If you pan them out too wide, it will sound very detached, which can be cool. And you know, somebody like Chris Lord-Alge does these hard pans, whereas one tom on the hard left and then one dead center and one on the hard right. And as you wear in headphones, it kind of goes whoosh all the way across. So it can be cool or interesting if that's your thing, but it can also be a little distracting. I'm getting a little bit of nearly clipping on this overhead track because they're kind of popping up. There's a couple ways to deal with certain things that are jumping around. And like the basic tools, compressors can help when the dynamics of a track are jumping. Another way to deal with that same thing is automation. And then another way is by distortion. And so I tend to like, when I do overheads, I will use, and I record them this way, I run through a Neve preamp. I'm on the wrong thing entirely. I run through a Neve preamp and I'll overdrive it. So let me just show you what that does. And in this case, there's something happening with the drums that I may need to address in a kind of fancy way. But a little bit of distortion coming from a preamp can be a pretty cool thing. So I can turn this up. And you can see my meters are going nuts. So I'm trimming back the output. And using just this little bit of overdrive on the preamp to make my snare splat. So you hear that crunch on the snare now? We go back to that big hits. Here's before. Notice that cymbal is kind of fully loud and the snare seems kind of quiet. After distortion, snares feel much louder, the cymbal feels about the same, because the cymbal's not going to get the same amount of distortion because it doesn't have much low end in it. So maybe a little bit too extreme. I'll take it back one notch. But this is a an expensive plugin. If you don't have the Neve plugin, you have others. Pro Tools comes with a bunch of distortion options. Not all of these, but some of these. These air distortions all work, and you could use the air distortion. You could use the Lo-Fi plugin is great. This is a freebie called IVGI 2, and it's a free plugin. And don't take it to the point where you really can hear the compression or the distortion. You're looking for just a little bit less than that. And it has a great effect also. All right. So now that I've done that, I'm going to check my balance again. Feels a little dry. But if you notice, because I've distorted out the transients, I can now turn this up quite a bit more before the snare drum starts to sound washy or distant. Because I've squished out all of that clarity from the overheads, it's going to then be heard better from the close mic. So it's kind of a way of keeping the overheads from jumping too far forward in the mix. And it'll let me get the cymbals as loud as I want because they're not going to get that distortion, so they'll pop up a little bit. There we go. Okay. Next, let's check our level again. Where are we at? Hitting around that -6 mark. The cymbals are popping up a little bit. And the snare is every now and then popping up a little bit because of that. Just the level recorded on it. I'm going to trim that down and turn this up. So I turned it down on the plugin and brought it back up on the track so that my level on the track is actually a little bit more consistent with my goal. Now that I have the overheads in there, I can deal with my toms. That level is a little hot, so I'm going to back it down on both of them. And the reason again for keeping it below 6 is I'm trying not to distort my analog plugins. It'd be like sending really loud signal through any console at the school. You'd notice that it starts to break up and add a little bit of distortion. And again, here we go. I'm panning them in not very wide This is totally a personal preference, but if I'm going big, I want the drums to sound like they're a little further away from me. And as things get further away, they start to seem smaller and smaller. And so that narrower pan definitely helps with that illusion of, man, this is a big space that I'm in. When you pan them wide, it sounds like you're closer. So, and again, I was just kind of getting levels there, just making them sound like they're balanced out. Oh, the other consideration is audience perspective versus drummer's perspective. Drummers like to listen to records in drummer's perspective. Anybody watching a video likes to hear audio in audience perspective, because as you watch that movie, you see the guitar player over on the left, and you want to hear the guitar on the left. And so depending on your background or what type of music you work on the most, you may have a preference as a mixer of which you use by default. I tend to stick with player's perspective, because in my mind, most of the people who listen to music don't care unless they're a drummer, and then the drummer does really care. So I want my drums to make drummers happy, so they hire me. That being said, if I'm doing anything live or to video, I'll probably do audience perspective, because that's what is logical. Notice that I'm keeping this hi-hat mic off for the moment. That's because I don't always use it, and I'm kind of going to rely a lot on the overheads and the room mics to bring in that hi-hat sound. And if I need it, I'll bring it up for sure, but I tend to start without it. We have this second snare mic. Let me get the last close mic in there. This is a very small, tight snare drum sound. So it's designed to give us some contrast from the big sound. But notice there's also a lot of hi-hat bleed on that. So as I bring that in, you start to hear a lot of the hi-hat showing up. And that may become a problem because I don't have control over that hi-hat. I can't balance it at all. And if I compress that snare drum or brighten it up, which it feels like it needs to, then I'm going to find out just how much bleed I've got, because that's going to get enhanced. Let's check out this mono overhead. Let's try to add that into our setup. Sounds already a little bit crunchy, kind of like that main one did. So it could be a ribbon mic. Let's skip up to where the drums are hitting. So it's got a good balance of everything in there. Here's without it. Kind of softening everything. So I think for the moment, I'm going to leave it muted. Didn't ever feel like it was adding a lot of stuff. Here's the room mics. These have some compression on them already. I can hear that it's been compressed. But drums at a distance naturally sound less punchy, less full. So I am okay with that. And actually, if I want to accentuate the distance, I can make it more distant sounding by compressing down the transient, and also by removing some highs and lows. As something goes farther away, like let's say you're listening to a drum kit from 50 feet away, you're not going to hear very much sub low end. You'll hear very little crispy super highs. You'll hear just a lot of mid range, and the quiet notes and the loud notes will sound pretty similar. That's just natural compression. So by compressing and filtering room mics, you can make them sound further away. We're mimicking what happens in the real world. Another thing that some people do is even exaggerate the natural space with like a reverb. So you might use the room mic as a way to trigger a large reverb. So it's naturally sounds distant, and then it sounds even more epic with a larger space. In this case, I'm going to hold off on that for now. And again, panning. Wide panned rooms tend to make the drums kind of shift outward and feel like you're being wrapped around by the space you're in. So if I'm trying to make room mics convincing and make them attach well to the drums, I might kind of move them in towards the center just a bit. I don't want to make it mono, but just more mono. And usually I'll just balance it up till I start to hear it, because I can always add more later. But if you're trying to mix with too much room mics, it can mess with your decision making. Here's another set of rooms. You can see on the meters that these are pretty lopsided. So maybe the two mics are like spaced pair or something, and they're not very similar. So I'm going to go to my trim plugin, unlink it so that I can turn up the right side to match the left side. Here's before, very left heavy, after. Okay, so when I listen to these mics, well, you listen with me and tell me what sounds closest. To me, those crash cymbals sound like they're jumping out much louder than the drums themselves. So I'm going to try to solve this problem just right off the bat so that as I balance it in, I'm balancing all my instruments more evenly. And cymbals, the part that's really obvious, tends to be up here. So by just turning that down, here we go. Now they sound kind of even with the drums, and we'll do more to them later. But for now, that just helps me balance inside of the pair of mics we've got there. Now it's a lot more balanced with itself. And again, for now, I'm just going to balance them up a little bit. And this last one, I can hear a bunch of compression on this one. Some distortion. Similar problem where the high frequency is letting the cymbals shine through. So I'm just going to roll some of that off and then try to balance it in. Alright, so now checking my main level here on this drum bus. Popping up a little bit here and there. I'm just going to back all of these down. Turned on my drum group with D. Looks better. All right, now they're roughly balanced to themselves. So now let's just listen and see what they need emotionally. You know, not worried about technical at this moment. Just what's it going to need to fit into the mix. I'll play by itself a little bit and then with the song. All right, so what I'm hearing is they just don't sound big enough. They don't sound punchy enough. And those are two different things, by the way. Punchy means they sound like they're nice and transient. They have a sharp attack. And that's the sort of thing that happens when you're close to a sound. And they don't sound big enough, which means like they don't have enough space. They don't have enough aggression. And that's going to come maybe more from the room mics and the sound right after the snap, the transient. It'll be more in the sustain of the drums. So I'm going to try to push the close mics to be a little more punchy and try to make the room mics a little more roomy and a little more aggressive overall. So let's look at our kick drum. I'm going to be using a couple of plugins that you may not have, but not because they're better than the ones you have. This Pro Q3 is very fancy, but I mainly am using it because it lets you see kind of what's happening on the instrument, and that kind of helps me explain some things better. It doesn't make it better than the stock Pro Tools EQ, because they will both do the same job as well. Hopefully you've heard these terms already, but I'm going to be looking for, on every instrument, 4 critical frequencies. So 4 parts of the sound that I can control. And the reason for that is, every sound is made up of a harmonic series. So it's not just any one note for any instrument. There's many notes involved. And most consoles will run something like this: a low shelf, low mid-bell, high shelf. And they do that for good reason, because that's a good way to approach a sound, and it's enough control to make a record. You've heard tons and tons of great sounding records, some of the best of which were done on analog consoles with only 4 bands of EQ. So when you get into a plugin like this, you can start to get yourself into trouble, because you see all these options and there's like, oh, there's a thing and there's a thing, and you start making changes all over the place. And pretty soon your sound has been Swiss cheesed into oblivion. And so what I'm going to be encouraging is find 4 parts of the sound and work with those 4. After you've moved on from that and everything is great, except for maybe a couple little tiny things, then it might be time to get in and get, fancy with stuff. So the bottom of the sound is always going to be called the fundamental. And on this kick drum, it's going to sound like this, which if you're listening on a phone or something, you probably can't even hear this. But you can see where those peaks are living. Let me try to make this a little more detailed. Resolution maximum. There's a big peak happening right here at about 42.5 hertz, 43 hertz. That's pretty typical for a kick drum, somewhere between 40 and 50. So the number I always just say is 45 hertz. Is about the bottom of most kick drums. This one's tuned down just a little bit to 42 hertz, which means in the harmonic series, there's going to be a lot of content at 42 hertz. There's going to be content at double that, 85 hertz in our case. And then there's going to be content at triple the 42, which is going to be 126, 7.5, somewhere in there. And those first couple of overtones generally are the meat of most of the sounds you work with. So the fundamental range might be just that very bottom note, or it might be kind of those bottom couple of overtones. On a kick drum, if you were to only hear the 42 hertz, 45 hertz, when you get into anything other than studio speakers or a car with subs, you're not going to hear that kick at all. So a lot of times the meat of what you hear on a small speaker, like a car stereo, not a fancy one, just minivan car stereo, or in a lot of speakers, like off of the TV when you listen to music on part of a movie, 80 hertz is going to be much more important, or 80 to 90 hertz. It's going to carry a lot more impact. I know one guy who calls it the thrust. That's the 80 hertz. And then that next overtone at 120, 130, somewhere in there, that's going to really start to show up in smaller speakers like cell phones, when people listen to that, or crappy earbuds or something like that. So we need those. We just need to be careful about our balance with them. Then I'm going to filter those out, and we'll get to listen for the next frequency up, which we'll call the resonance. And as you get above those bottom ones, let me turn this up a little bit. It's going to sound very boxy, very shut down, and starts to sound like a trash can to me. I call it the bucket on a drum. This resonance is like that thing that makes it just sound like a plastic bucket instead of a big drum. Then the character is the thing that makes most sounds stand forward. It's the upper mid-range, high mid-bell. And if you lean up into this stuff on a drum, the character is going to equal a lot of the noise of the impact. So the beater hitting the kick drum or the stick hitting the snare drum. And you hear that beater in there. And that can be really nice to make stuff stand forward. There's a lot of records that have a kick drum with a ton of that beater clicking sound in there. But if you go above that, you're going to find that up here, it's more zappy. It's softer. Feels more like smacking a piece of paper than it does smacking a piece of wood. So what I've found is that part up there is sometimes a much more pleasant and listenable frequency range than the upper mid range. So let's use a low shelf to control our fundamental, and I'm going to set that in the right frequency, but I'm going to leave the gain alone. Then we'll find our resonance. There's that boxiness. It's a lot of times right around 300, sometimes 250, sometimes 400 or 500, but it's somewhere in that range. If you went with 300, most of the time you'd be fine with that. And then the resonance, the character, or on a drum, it's kind of a stick attack, somewhere in the 1,000 hertz for this kind of knockier sound, up to 5,000 hertz, which is a much clickier, pokier sound, or somewhere in between, or really it's going to be a bell that kind of controls all of that. And then a high shelf up above that bite. Let me get these out of your way. So that high shelf up here can add brightness without a lot of click. Once you've found those 4 critical frequencies, then you have the ability to control your sound. I don't recommend just like randomly grabbing things and listening for what you like or don't like. I highly recommend you find the parts of the sound you can work with, put all the gains back to 0, and then you have a simple decision. You listen to it and you say, does this work or does it not work? Is it bright enough? Is it full enough? Is it too boxy? Not boxy enough? In our case, this one sounds a little bit boxy to me. And that's based on instinct that I've kind of honed over a lot of years. I'm even going to shift it downward just a little. It sounds a little too dull. Everything else about it sounded pretty good. Here's without it bypassed. So even just that little bit of low mid cut, high mid or high shelf boost did a big shift. And in my mind, it sounds quite a bit better. But listen to it with a bass guitar going. And when I bypass this, hear how they merge together? The kick and the bass guitar seem a little muddier. And when I do this, the bass guitar suddenly has all the clarity that it was missing a moment ago. Here's without it, bypassed. With it. I feel like I can hear each note. And that's because of this right here. They're fighting for this space. That bass guitar uses this space, and I can even show you at the same time. Now the purple on this is the kick drum, and the red is the bass. So the bass is using a lot of this area right in here, and if the kick uses too much of that, it's going to conflict. So that's usually that like fundamental times 3, where that overlaps a lot. So if your fundamental is 45, your first overtone is 90, second is 135. And if you cut a little bit of that, you'll be creating space specifically for the bass. And that's kind of what we did with this low mid bell. That resonance buckety stuff we got rid of. Okay, then we're going to be doing the same kind of thing for the snare drum. I'm going to do this one without all the fancy visuals. We'll use a stock EQ because I want you to know how to do this. So to find the fundamental, here's an easy way. Start at the very bottom and take your frequency all the way down and do a big boost. And you can tell that when I turn this on and off, not much is changing. But as I go up, There. Suddenly it changed. Without it. With it. It thumps a lot harder. Without. So that's my fundamental. Because as I went up, it didn't do anything until I reached a certain point. And at that point, that was suddenly impacting the part of the thing that is my sound. Then we're going to look for the bucket. And we can start at the same point, even if you want. Do a little boost here. And I'm looking for this thing that sounds really tight. As I go way up, I start to get into the brightness and stick attack. So it's not that. Cool. Here's without. And then I usually skip this yellow one and we'll just head right up to the high mids and we're looking for stick attack. Somewhere at the like 1.5, 2K, it's usually going to tip from being knocky or woody, like that, up to being snappy and bright. So depending on what you were handed, whether the snare drum was recorded with the mic pointed right at where the stick hits the drum, you might have a very clicky sound. If it's pointed down, straight down at the drum head, it might be very dull. You know, you'll have to kind of evaluate each time what the drum is going to need and which part of that sound you need control over. If it's sounding really hollow, you might need to add a little bit of that woody, boxy, or 1K thing. If it's sounding really snappy, maybe too snappy, you might end up needing to pull down some of that clicky stick on plastic sound. So right about here is kind of the midway point of that. So I'm going to call that my character and we'll leave it alone. Put the gain back to 0. Then I'm going to boost the highs, and here I would start high and work your way back down. And at a certain point it'll start to get that clickiness from the snare drum. Very tappy and clicky. So I'd go up until I get beyond that. Now it's not as clicky anymore and it's more just fizzy. And put that gain back down. So now I've done my research and I know where these 4 points are. And as I listen, it sounds a little bit boxy. So I'm going to pull some of that out. Sounds a little bit dull. So I'm going to add a little bit of air. If I boost stick attack, it gets closer sounding and more tight. If I cut some of that stick attack, it's gonna sound a little bit bigger, but further away. Close. And so this is now a mixed decision of like how close do I want this thing to sound. And if you remember, the track is kind of epic, so my goal is for it to sound a little bit further away, but not a lot. Here's without it. With it. So I'm getting a nice brightness on the snare, but I'm also getting a lot of cymbal bleed, and sometimes I may find the need to like low pass 10 or 12K, get rid of a little bit of the tappiness from the cymbals, but without really affecting the brightness of the snare. Here's the 2 without anything. And it's that mostly that brightness and the low mid cut that we're doing there. I can even show you the EQ curve on each. You can see it's this low mid cut, high end bump, maybe a little low end bump sometimes. A lot of times we call that the smiley face, because the lows and highs will be protected or even boosted, while the mids might drop down. And that helps make close mics sound closer and bigger and more exciting. And then oftentimes we're going to be doing something kind of reverse on the room mics. If our goal was to make the close mics closer and the room mics further, I might do a frowny face on the rooms to get rid of a little top and bottom, and fast compression to kill transients. So now let's do a little bit of compression. I want them to hit a little harder than they are and be a little more consistent than they are. This drummer is very dynamic with his kicks, and he's doing it on purpose, but in a track like this, I need it to be a little bit simpler. And you can EQ before and after compression. It really depends on personal preference. Sometimes there's a clear winner one way, and then you try again the next day on a different drum track, and it works better the other way. So the best way to do it is compress it and then try flipping it back and forth. In general, I would say that if you EQ first with big cuts, like if you're removing a bunch of low end in particular, your compressor afterward will sound more natural to you. If you do a bunch of big cuts after you've compressed it, the compressor might feel like it's moving strangely because it was reacting to parts of the sound that you are never hearing again. So especially if you're doing low cuts, you want that to happen first. Okay, so here's a compressor. We know we have 4 controls: attack and release, control the speed of it; thresholding ratio, control the amount of compression. But I would say in general, let me show you this compressor. This is an SSL compressor. And here's the release knob for that compressor. It goes anywhere between 0.1 seconds or 100 milliseconds and 4 seconds. But the attack knob is this right here. There is no sweepable attack control. Your choice is either fast or slow. And I think that tells you a lot about what you can maybe be listening for within this. Release time is going to be a little more tweakable and more flexible, where attack is generally, do I want this fast enough to attack the transient, or do I want the transient to slip by because I'm going to be compressing the sustain of the sound? If I want a snare drum to be more consistent, I need to compress the transient and the sustain so that the whole thing just gets brought down when it's too loud. If I'm trying to make a snare drum more aggressive, I want more transient probably, and that means let the compressor wait a moment, a slow attack, let that transient through, and then turn down the sustain to exaggerate the distance between the beginning and the end of the sound. And so it starts much louder and immediately gets quieter. It'll make it sound like it was hit harder. So let's go back to our kick drum. And remember, I wanted our kick to be a little more consistent. So I'm going to make sure that the attack speed is fast enough to grab the beginning of the transient. And I'm just going to be gentle with it. I'm not trying to make him, every hit the same. I'm just trying to make it more consistent. So I'll probably keep the ratio kind of low, and I'm going to slow down the release so that it catches the beginning of the hit and then also stays down for a while. And if you wanted to cheat, you could go look at how close your kick hits are. I want my release time to be back up to nearly full volume by the time this next hit happens. And if I were to just change my minutes and seconds, that's 358 milliseconds between kick hits on that fastest hit that he does. So, somewhere in that world. I'm not going to go to 2 seconds in between release times. Then my goal here is how much compression do I need? I'm going to set the threshold based around getting the amount of compression I need. And if you look at the tracks, they're fairly consistent. There are just a couple of moments like in this section where one gets a little bit too quiet. So what I might do sometimes is go over here and just watch my meters for a second and listen, and you can tell which ones are louder and which ones are quieter, and we'll see the distance between them. So loud one is here. Quiet one is down here at like minus probably 13 or something. Loud one was at like minus 7. So that's 6 dB of difference. So I might be looking for something about 6 dB of compression, maybe a little less. Cool. And now I've lost volume. You can see my input level is higher than my output. So let's use some makeup gain. And now let's listen to that same section again. The brightness changes, so the first one still sounds louder because it's clickier, but in general the volumes are more similar, and that's going to make it easier to mix because it'll sit still better, and the kick and bass will always balance a little bit better after that compression. And I'll end up doing the same kind of compression to the bass. You know, compressing the bass down to make it more consistent so that it will blend better with the kick drum. All right. Okay, you can go away, bass. Now let's say I wanted to make that kick sound like it was hitting a little harder. I could go to that same compressor. I could try a different compressor with different settings, but let's try this 1176. And what I'm going to do here is let the attack be slow. And it's going to let a good chunk of the transient through, most of the transient through of the kick drum. So that won't get turned down, but the sustain will. If I really pump it, you start to hear that click really accentuated. So that would make it sound like it was being hit harder. Same thing, I'll copy over. Here's the first compressor. Here is the second compressor. And if I just take the attack speed and slow it down on the second one, speed up the release time, let's raise the ratio a little bit so it hits a little harder, because the whole point of this is to make it more aggressive. Adjusting the threshold till I get the compression I want. Here's without it. Without it. Just sounds like he was coming at it with a little more gusto. Here's the snare drum. His snares are pretty consistent. He does pop out when he wants to, and hits like these first couple. These are definitely sounding louder and more forward than these are. So I want to make it a little more consistent. So hey, look at that. I'll just copy over that first compressor that was making my kick more consistent, and it will probably work on my snare. And then that second compressor with the slower attack. Here's a way to adjust this, and I'll do this the methodical way, I guess. If you make your attack and release really quick, raise your ratio up and get a bunch of compression going, you'll get to hear what a fully crushed sound does. So listen to how that crunches. Now I'm going to slow down the attack, and as I slow down the attack, listen for the transient, the very beginning of the sound where the stick actually hits the drum. Listen for how that's going to pop out. Right there, you hear it? Here's faster again, kind of crunching. And then suddenly it sounded like the snare got a little louder. That's because that stick attack was making it through. Crunched. And that pop's now making it through. So in this case, because I'm trying to make this snare sound more aggressive, I need that pop to come through. So I'm going to leave it here at like 13, 14 milliseconds. Generally, it's like 10 to 15 milliseconds is about how quick that transient is. On a kick drum, it's a bigger, slower instrument, and the transient on a kick drum is probably more like 30, 40 milliseconds before it'll feel like that transient really popped through past your compressor. Then I'm going to work on release time. And the release is going to control how much sustain I have. So if I have a really quick release, the compressor won't stay down long and it will pop up all my quiet sources. If I use a really long release time, it will turn down everything after my transient and stay down for a while. So listen as I slow that down. Hear that pop? It's quick. All the ghost notes, the cymbal bleed, and the ring of the drum all pops out as I slow it down. Starts to sound further away, more poppy. Here's way down. So a lot of snap and transient, but not a lot of body anymore. And I'm going to split the difference. I want to be in the middle there somewhere. Somewhere in there. Feels good. Then I'll go back to a more sane ratio, kind of middle of the road, 4 or 5 to 1, something like that. I'm going to do no compression so you can hear what it did before. There's a threshold all the way up. Here's without it. With it. Kind of pops out. The transient seems more in your face. And here's with neither compressor or EQ. With it. Without. With. Without. Cool. So again, just to recap, first one was a low ratio, so it's gentle, but fast attack and slower release. That's going to make all the hits more consistent if you need that. If your drums are pre-programmed, you're not going to need anything like that. And then this second one here was designed to let the transients through and turn down the sustain a little bit. And it needs to be a little more aggressive and a little more powerful. So we raise the ratio, slow down the attack, speed up the release a little bit, but that's going to be to taste. You know, that's depending on whether you want a ringier snare or a tighter snare, you'll have to figure out on your own. Neither of them are doing a ton of compression, like 3 dB on each. I think the cumulative between the two is looking like about 6 dB of compression, maybe a touch more. But that's not a massive amount at all. All right. Another thing that I think benefits a lot from a little compression, sometimes the overheads. Because that same dynamic that was happening on the kick and the snare is going to survive all the way into the overheads. It's not as dramatic because they're further away, but it's still there. This is a fancier way to do that same thing. This is a analog style compressor. And I don't know, I just have a setting on here that I really like. But it's a similar sort of thing. Fast attack, slower, slower release time. It says 100, but it sounds like slower than that. And then I just adjust the threshold for the amount I want. But it really kind of glues my drums together. Here's without it. With it. When you get into analog style stuff or even digital plugins, you'll see a lot of these things that say link or unlink or stereo link your compression, mono or stereo. And what that does is is it compresses based on where the action happens. So a stereo compressor can react to both sides equally. So think of the overheads here. We've got rack tom on one side, floor tom on the other. If you hit the floor tom, two unlinked compressors or two mono compressors would react differently. The one over on the mic pointed at the floor tom is going to turn down, and the one pointed at the rack tom won't really turn down much because it wasn't loud over there. It was loud over here. And so what happens is your overheads have this nice stereo balance, and if one compresses, the volumes shift, and suddenly you're listening more to the one that had nothing happening. You know, the floor tom side turned down, and now by balance, you're listening more to the rack tom side. And if they're panned left and right, that's going to mean your center image is going to shift and bounce back and forth. Every time something on the left happens, your image shifts to the right. So that can be a really cool thing, and it can create some width and some movement within the mix, or it can be very distracting. And if you link them together, anything on either side, left hand of the piano turns down the right hand of the piano. Floor tom turns down the rack tom side of the overheads. It's again, that's one of those things that's going to be a preference. Try one, then try the other. See what you like. Toms are going to need to be made more consistent. And let's go to this section with a bunch of toms. They're not inconsistent, but I need to make them very consistent. So I could grab that same compressor that I had on my snare or on my kick. It would be a very similar setting. A little bit lower ratio, faster attack, slower release to kind of clamp the beginning of the sound down and then just stay down for a little while. Let me show you another plugin that I like to use for this, and it's a cheapie, so it's worth looking into. Some plugins are very expensive, like that Neve and that thing that I just pulled up, but this one is 24 euros, I think, so very affordable, and it's great. It's 3 different tube compressor models, and I like this one a lot. And density is a tube you can click in. It sounds like you've added a vacuum tube, like ran through a piece of tube gear. This one is an extra transformer you can kick in, and has your normal compression controls like threshold, attack, release. This one is a ratio switch between regular and high ratio. And it's great. This is the knee, which is like the smoothness of the compression. But I have a setting in here called Tom Leveler, which I've set very hard knee, fast attack, slower release, and it adds this tube sound. And one thing I like about this is it has automatic gain compensation. So as it turns down, it's automatically bringing your volume back up. So you can compare the amount of compression without hearing a bunch of volume changes. And I just kind of go through each track, readjust the threshold to just get a more reasonable amount of compression. I used too much makeup gain there. I'm clipping the output. All right, now let's try to make our rooms a little bit bigger. For what it's worth, on those toms, I'm not necessarily done yet. I might also do the same make them punchier kind of setting. I might do a little bit of smiley facing to make them sound a little bigger or closer to me. But for now, I want to keep it moving. We're not going to do 6 hours on this thing. So room mics, let's go check those out real quick. I liked these, even though they were a little more unbalanced. I liked the distance and size of them. So let's talk about how to make them more distant. If I were to do one of these, the more I do it, the more they start to sound further away. At a certain point, they sound so far away that it's not really useful, but I do want to get rid of a little bit of that tubbiness on the low end, but then I want to bring up the sustain of these and turn down the transient. So there's a couple ways to do it. One is use that stock compressor again. Speed up the attack, speed up the release, and go to a high ratio. So I'm intentionally crushing those transients. And then bring up the makeup gain. Here's without. Yeah, hear how that much louder and bigger they sound? This sounds a little closer to me. And now I have a lot more sustain, more like echo in that room. So that's a cool way to do it. I like this plugin that I have. And we have this in our Trident studio. I'm sorry, in the SSL studio and also in the Lodge, this Transient Designer. And you can just deal with the attack of your sound. So this is making it really punchy. And that's making it not punchy at all, stealing the transient away. So this is like all transient. This is all sustain. Without it. And I like it to be a little bit over the top because it's not going to be this loud in the mix. So I don't mind if it's a little bit aggressive. So here's the drums without it. And again, I'm going to blend it up from the bottom. And that snare needs to have a nice solid impact. So I'll turn it up until I lose that. In this area, it sounds big, but I've lost the thump and the tightness of the drum. Now I have the tightness back, but I've lost the bigness. Somewhere in there. And because there's a lot of cymbal bleed and a lot of compression and stuff, you can only go so loud before it starts to really mess with everything and things will pump a lot. So it's going to stay fairly low, but by doing this, it allows me to hear the sustain of the sound because of this. It allows me to hear that sustain much easier without having to turn the fader up so much. And because I've removed a little of the attack, when I do turn it up, I can get a little louder before I mess up the snare transient. So it's a helpful tool to kind of draw out the sustain. But it's a similar effect to what we did with that first compressor, which was also doing the same, like bring up the transient, or bring down the transient, bring up the sustain. So fast attack, fast release will help you grab that transient and squish it. And generally a higher ratio. All right. And I want these drums to be a little meaner. So my smash mic is a lot of times my place to do that. So let's make it angry. Let's do some distortion. There's a lot of good ways to distort. And they're all cool. That IVGI, that free plugin, it's the same people that make that Klanghelm MJUC. Where'd you go? Here's without it. Pretty cool. Puts a little like bark on there, a little growl. You could do more of like an amplifier kind of situation. If I go to this Sans amp, sounds more like it's running through like a guitar or bass amplifier. that. And I might get rid of some of those highs. Get rid of some of that trashy cymbal stuff. And it adds that little growl in there, but I don't want too much of it. A lot of times it's just the amount that you can hear and no more. So if we mute these, here's the drums without any of that ambient stuff. With it. Suddenly they sound bigger, they sound more cohesive, like a real kit. Then let me show you what I do on my drums subgroup. So now all that is running through here, and you can see it all. And I'm going to use some fancy plugins, but you can use a lot of the stock plugins are great. I usually reach for some sort of tape machine because I want it to get that old school tape compression that works really, really well with drums. It's still the reason that people go to tape is generally just because of drums. So there is the real tape saturation. This comes with the Pro Tools subscription. That's a good one. It's not my favorite, but it works for sure. And you can also just use this Lo-Fi plugin. Lo-Fi adds just like a tiny bit of distortion and a tiny bit of saturation. Just like a tape machine would. Here's without that. But be careful with that because it will fool you. There's no output trim. So the reason you maybe like it is just because it got louder. Sometimes when you add distortion, it's like boosting the level and it can trick you into thinking that it's better. I'm going to show you what I use, which is often this Studer tape machine. This one comes with Apollo stuff, Universal Audio stuff, and they've got a subscription plugin plan now that will include this. So I'm going to push the input till I start hitting up in that meter there. And then here's a little trick that I use sometimes. I'll crank the bias, which screws with the tone a little bit, adds a little more distortion, and it makes it darker. But then I'm going to boost this high frequency driver, which essentially kind of compensates for that. So now I'm going to end up with just a little bit fizzier and more distorted high end. But it, to my ear, often helps make it more like polished sounding and less raw. Here's without. With. It's pretty subtle. Without. With. But it's cool. Subtle but cool. Another subtle tool that I like is there's a couple different ways you can get analog style saturation. If you go to there's a free one from Softube. If you just sign up with an account for them, they'll give you a handful of free plugins. This one is killer. It's just like a tube. It has some really gnarly stuff if you go extreme with it, but just in subtle amounts, it's so good. I'm going to go to a Helios plugin. This is Universal Audio again, and it's based on an old Helios console, and I really like the saturation it does on drums. So what I do is I'll turn up the input to get a little bit of distortion. It's that, but only barely. And then I use the output fader to kind of bring my level back to that -6 mark. Sometimes I'll use the EQ a little bit. Like if I've got a little too much boxiness on the whole kit, I'll turn that one in from a peak to a trough, which just means it's cutting now. Cut out a little mid-range, or maybe add a little brightness if I need that. But generally I'm just here for that saturation. Here's the drums without either of those. With both. And then I'd also tend to like a little bit of compression hitting the entire drum kit. There's a lot of good ones for that. The SSL style compressor that you'll see a lot. The G-Bus looks like this. Very common plugin, or some version or remake of it. But there's one called the TDR Kotelnikov. I'll spell it. Kotlnikov. TDR Kotelnikov. Is a freebie, and it's a great drum bus compressor. Really cool. I'm going to use one that's not. So here we go. And I have my own preset in here because you can build your own, not because I'm famous. And it's the same basic controls as normal: threshold, attack, ratio, release, and then knee, and then stereo link if you want that, and then a mix knob, which is very handy. Mix knob at 100% means you're listening to the compressed signal. So it's a lot of compression. Now here's no compression because it's at 0%. So some people call this New York style compression, but it's a parallel compression, meaning you're hearing some uncompressed and some compressed. I'm gonna turn down this just a little bit. Between those two, I'm driving just a little bit too hard. And then I'm often going to hit an EQ, an overall EQ on the drum kit. Instead of trying to EQ 5 different channels to get it to be a little bit brighter, a lot of times I'll start with some more broad strokes on the bus itself. And more often than not, I'm going to be pulling a little of the bucket sound out of the snare drum. And a lot of times I'll roll off all the super highs, because the only thing happening up here is little stick clicks and noise off the cymbals. And it's not always necessary, and on this track I think I wouldn't need it, but sometimes it's a great thing to just like darken your drums a little bit, and other stuff will suddenly pop out, like your acoustic guitar, your vocal will pop out if the drums aren't so shiny and tappy and distracting. Sometimes I'll also need to roll off a touch of rumble from below the kick drum. So if the bottom of my kick was at 45, I might filter out at 25, like a whole octave below it. Get rid of just all this junk, because there's nothing musical really happening down in that area. But what can happen is it can, all that low end voltage can kind of pile up and make your limiter at the last step in mastering not work as well. So this is kind of getting rid of unused real estate. And then my level dropped a little bit, so I'm going to use my makeup here, get myself back up to -6. And by making it more consistent before and after my plugins, I can hit Shift A, bypass all of those plugins, and you can hear the before and after. And here, they sound okay, but they sound pretty disconnected, like the close mic and the room mics and stuff. There's a lot of space in there. And this has really tightened them up into feeling like they're a more cohesive sound. And they're kind of in a smaller, tighter package, which will leave more room for other instruments to do their thing. After all that, maybe the rooms are a little bit loud. Doing saturation and compression on the drum bus tends to make them kind of bring up the quieter sections. Cymbals are jumping a little bit. Those crashes and the aggressive hi-hat are kind of jumping out to me. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll grab a de-esser. And a de-esser is just listening for high frequency stuff. And, you know, I always save my presets once I get something figured out. But overhead high transient control is kind of set based around that. So you can see every time it's turning down, it's those hi-hat hits that are really hitting aggressively, and the big crash at the beginning of that section. Turn down the high frequencies so it kind of balances in there a lot more smoothly. And for what it's worth, another fun trick, if your high overheads are kind of harsh or clicky, you can go into Audio Suite noise reduction. And if you've ever bought the RX, Isotope RX elements, which you can get a lot of times on sale for like $30, there's one in here called Declick. And it's a great way to get rid of a little bit of stick click off of the track. Because sometimes like the tip of the stick hitting the metal of the cymbal, if it's not mic'd well with good mics and good placement, can cause these little clicks that really jump out of the mix. And I'll every now and then reach for something like this, and I think I will on this track when I mix it finally. Get rid of a little bit of that tappiness from the overhead, so I don't have to darken them to tame that. That's all without any samples at all, and they sound pretty good to me. You know, feel like big and powerful. So that's usually what I would try to do, is like I'll start there, and then if I feel like, you know what, that snare could use a little help, I might grab that sample that we hit earlier. Need to make sure it's routed along with the drums. And that one just hits a lot harder. You can hear that one's kind of gentle. Blend in a little bit of that sample. And then I probably need some size. You know, we're still sounding like we're in a room. So let's create a reverb, send it to a new track. And let's call this Drum Verb, Dr. Verb. I'm going to route that guy also through my drum bus. And that's not a necessity. You may like it better going, you know, right out to your mix. I like it to run through here because when I'm printing my stems at the end, my final mixes will include that. And if I end up doing an EQ or volume change to my drum kit, it'll go with it. But I'm not going to send the verb from every track equally. So I'm not going to send it from the drum subgroup. I'll send it from the individual channels. And we've got an aux track there, reverb. There's a lot of things that are great. Deverb, even the stock Pro Tools one, is totally usable. The studio verb that comes with Pro Tools subscriptions is good. There's a good cheap one called Valhalla Vintage Verb. It's $50, and it's got a great set of different sounds. It can do like small ambiances, giant ambiances, nonlinear stuff like gated reverbs if you want to make it sound like Phil Collins, plates, a lot of different good things. So I don't know, you can kind of click through on some of these. Each song is going to have its own vibe, and sometimes, you know, like a big giant snare, like a ballad snare. going to go that big, you probably end up wanting to make that verb more mono. Otherwise, you end up with like reverb swimming around on the low sides. Like when you wear headphones, you'll feel this reverb kind of swimming around over here. So you might end up making that a little more mono, or maybe even getting rid of a little low, cutting a little bit of lows off of your track. So I like it. I'm going to shorten it up. Kind of live more in the space between hits instead of crossing over each snare hit. It's also very helpful sometimes when your overheads are a little bit obnoxious and sticking out. The cymbals have potential to do that. I might add a little verb from there, which is going to add verb both for my cymbals and those little stick taps, but it's also going to add a little verb to my snare drum because it's there as well. And then if you really wanted to get a huge drum sound, you could take your rooms, which already sound pretty big, and you could send them to the verb. More or less than the other mics. You kind of have to just experiment. But now that big sound is even bigger. Here's without that room mic. With it. Can be cool from that. That's a little too much. Or it can be cool sometimes just from this mono. If you have something like that. Generally speaking, I'm not going to add any verb on my kick drum. Very few exceptions to that, though they do exist. But on a rock track, generally the kick drum is going to want to live up near the front of the mix, and that means no reverb. Or very little reverb, and if you do add reverb, definitely reverb with very little low end in it, so that you're not getting this boomy thing floating throughout the whole song. You want it to be a little more like airy and make it sound like you're in a drum room instead of like a close mic or something. I think that is enough for one day. I can and would keep going on some of these things and keep cleaning up all these other tracks, but I think you've got the ideas. Big things to watch out for is compression, fast attack to make the transients more consistent, slow attack to make the transients more obvious. And that will make them more punchy. The EQ curve is generally going to be this kind of smiley face thing. Protect or even enhance the low end, brighten up the top end for more clarity and presence than normally shows up on drum mics, and remove some of that boxiness because you're really close to a wooden shell on these drums, and that's causing a lot of this buildup, which dissipates when you listen from across the room, but when your mics are right there, you're going to hear that. So we'll end up doing a low mid cut and potentially high and or low boost on most close mics of drums, and then something more towards the reverse for room mics. Getting rid of a little bit of highs, getting rid of some lows, so they sound further away. And again, balance. Start with your close mics, get them working, get their levels right, and then try to keep your levels good throughout the rest of the time. And don't let your room mics and your overheads screw up your close mics. If you go too loud with them, your whole drum kit's going to get kind of noisy, and it won't have a nice snap or impact to it. And so be careful with that. If you need more room mics than you're able to do without them getting weak sounding or without them sounding, the drum itself sounding distant, not just the room sounding big, but it sounds like it's on the far side of it, then you might have to take your rooms and make them sound bigger than they naturally are through compression, filtering out the highs and lows on the EQ, maybe even adding verb to them to help create a little bit of sense of distance from the room. If you can make the room sound further away, your close mics will still sound close, and then you've got a separation between those two. All right. There's a lot more that we could go into, but this gives you plenty to work on. So best of luck. I'll see you around.